The emergency broadcast crackled through the bunker's speakers at 3:47 a.m. All units, we have multiple breaches on level 3. Repeat, the infected have broken through the steel barriers. Sarah's blood ran cold as she heard the screams echoing through the ventilation system. The government had promised them safety. They said the bunker was impenetrable. They lied. The creatures that had once been human were now pounding on the reinforced doors just floors above them. But these weren't ordinary zombies. Something far worse had evolved in the darkness outside. And now they were hunting inside what was supposed to be humanity's last refuge. Welcome to Shadowverse. Don't forget to subscribe and comment your favorite horror topic below. Your suggestions fuel our darkest stories. The recruitment posters looked so convincing. Clean white hallways, smiling families gathered around dining tables, children playing in recreational areas that seemed to stretch forever underground. Sanctuary assured, the bold letters promised. Your family's future, guaranteed. Sarah remembered clutching her daughter's hand as they stood in line outside the processing center. Thousands of desperate families all believing they'd won the lottery of survival. The government representatives wore pressed uniforms and confident smiles as they handed out pamphlets detailing the bunker's specifications. Reinforced titanium walls, independent air filtration systems, food supplies for 20 years, military-grade security protocols. What they didn't mention was the real purpose of Facility 7 Delta. The first red flag should have been the medical examinations. Not just basic health checks, but extensive blood work, genetic testing, psychological evaluations that lasted hours. They separated families during processing, claiming it was standard procedure for efficient integration. Sarah's daughter Emma was taken to the More Children's Orientation Wing, while Sarah filled out form after form in a sterile white room. Just temporary, the nurse assured her. All families are reunited within 48 hours of arrival. That was 6 months ago. The bunker wasn't anything like the brochures. Instead of spacious family quarters, they were crammed into dormitory-style pods with dozens of strangers. The recreational areas existed, but they were monitored by cameras that tracked every movement, every conversation. The dining hall served processed protein bars and vitamin supplements that tasted like chalk. But the worst part was the sounds at night. Mechanical humming that seemed to come from deep below their level. Occasional screams that the guards claimed were just the ventilation system adjusting to pressure changes. The way certain residents would disappear overnight, with officials explaining they'd been transferred to specialized housing units. Sarah had tried asking about Emma dozens of times. Each inquiry was met with the same response. All children are being cared for in age-appropriate facilities. Reunification protocols will commence once the surface threat has been neutralized. She was beginning to understand that neutralization was never the plan. The truth started unraveling when Sarah befriended Marcus, a former CDC researcher who'd been recruited for his expertise in viral containment. He'd been asking too many questions about the facility's actual research objectives, and the answers he was getting didn't match the public narrative about zombie outbreak containment. They're not trying to keep things out, Marcus whispered during their assigned recreation hour, his voice barely audible over the artificial white noise pumped through the speakers. Look at the door mechanisms. They're designed to lock from the outside, not the inside. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she processed his words. She'd noticed the same thing, but convinced herself she was being paranoid. The heavy steel barriers that supposedly protected them from the infected outside world. They could only be operated from the exterior corridors where the guards patrolled. Marcus had been secretly mapping the facility during his work assignments in the lower levels. What he'd discovered made Sarah's blood run cold. Entire sections dedicated to biological research that had nothing to do with finding a cure. Laboratory spaces equipped for live specimen observation. Holding cells designed not for temporary quarantine, but for long-term containment of subjects that were very much alive. They're not studying the outbreak, Marcus continued, his hands trembling as he sketched rough facility blueprints on a scrap of paper. They're studying us. Our responses to stress, isolation, fear. How quickly social structures break down under pressure. What it takes to turn ordinary people into. He never finished that sentence because that's when the first alarm started blaring. The facility's emergency lighting bathed everything in pulsing red as automated voice commands echoed through the corridors. All residents returned to designated quarters immediately. This is not a drill. Security protocols are now in effect. But Sarah could hear something else underneath the official announcements. Something that made her realize Marcus had been right about everything. The sounds weren't coming from malfunctioning ventilation systems or pressure adjustments. They were coming from things that had once been human, and they were getting closer. The perfect lie was about to become a deadly reality, and the people who'd promised them safety were nowhere to be found. The government's deception ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. As chaos erupted around them, Sarah and Marcus discovered the facility's real purpose hidden in classified documents scattered during the evacuation of the research levels. Project Deadfall wasn't designed to protect humanity from the zombie outbreak. It was designed to study what happened when different types of infected creatures were introduced to contained human populations. The bunker residents weren't survivors. They were test subjects in the largest behavioral study ever conducted. The documents revealed the horrifying scope of the experiment. Multiple facilities across the country, each containing thousands of unsuspecting families, all monitored and manipulated to generate data on human survival responses. Some bunkers were subjected to resource scarcity to study the breakdown of social cooperation. Others faced systematic psychological pressure to measure stress thresholds. Facility 7 Delta had drawn the worst assignment: direct contact protocols with hostile entities. The infected that were now breaking through the barriers hadn't accidentally found the bunker. They'd been deliberately led here, drawn by electromagnetic signals that had been broadcasting from the facility's lowest levels for weeks. The research team wanted to observe how quickly an organized human community would collapse when faced with an immediate existential threat. But they'd miscalculated something crucial. The zombies weren't the only predators that had learned to track the facility's signals. Sarah's hand shook as she read the final entry in the research logs. Unexpected complication. Vampiric entities have also responded to the beacon frequencies. Initial contact suggests heightened intelligence and coordinated hunting behavior. Facility evacuation protocols may need to be implemented ahead of schedule. The timestamp showed the entry had been made 3 hours ago. The researchers had fled, leaving behind their human subjects to face not just mindless zombie hordes, but something far more dangerous. Creatures that could think, plan, and adapt. The bunker that was supposed to be their salvation had become their tomb, and the real monsters weren't the ones breaking down the doors. They were the ones who'd locked those doors from the outside and thrown away the keys while families slept, trusting in promises that were never meant to be kept. The first breach happened at 11:43 p.m. on Level 3, Section C. Sarah heard the metal tearing before the screams started. The reinforced barriers that had supposedly been tested against Category 5 impact scenarios crumpled like aluminum foil under the relentless assault of hundreds of infected bodies. The zombies moved with a coordinated hunger that defied everything the government briefings had claimed about their random, mindless behavior. But within minutes, Sarah realized the zombies weren't the apex predators everyone had feared. The vampires came through the ventilation system. Unlike the shambling hordes that had broken through the main barriers, these creatures moved with calculated precision. They dropped silently from air ducts, materialized from shadows that shouldn't have been dark enough to hide anything. And worst of all, they spoke. Fresh blood, one of them whispered as it cornered a family near the emergency stairs. Confined, concentrated, aged to perfection in fear. Sarah grabbed Marcus and pressed themselves against the wall as both types of monsters flooded into the facility's main corridor simultaneously. The zombies, driven by base instinct and overwhelming numbers, crashed through doorways and overwhelmed anyone too slow to run. The vampires, fewer in number but infinitely more strategic, cut off escape routes and herded panicking residents into dead ends where they could feed without interference. The bunker's layout, which had seemed so secure during orientation, became a maze of death traps. Long, straight corridors with no cross passages meant nowhere to hide from the zombie hordes. But the vampire covens used those same corridors as hunting channels, forcing terrified families to choose between certain death by overwhelming numbers or certain death by creatures that could drain them dry in seconds. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows as the two species of predators began to encounter each other in the facility's cramped spaces. Sarah watched in horror as a group of zombies stumbled into a vampire feeding frenzy near the main dining hall. What happened next changed everything she thought she knew about survival. Because when predators clash in an enclosed space, the real victims aren't always who you'd expect. The vampire-zombie confrontations were nothing like the movies had prepared them for. When the first group of infected stumbled into the vampire's feeding area, Sarah expected immediate carnage. Instead, she witnessed something far more terrifying: negotiation. The lead vampire, a pale figure in what had once been an expensive suit, didn't attack the zombies. Instead, he gestured toward the huddled mass of human survivors cowering in the corner. "Take the weak ones," he said in a voice like grinding glass. "Leave the healthy specimens for us." The zombies, which everyone had assumed were mindless, actually responded. They turned away from the vampires and focused their attention on the elderly residents and injured survivors who couldn't run fast enough to escape. Sarah realized with growing horror that both species were intelligent enough to recognize that cooperation meant more efficient hunting than competition. The zombies would exhaust and weaken the human population through sheer terror and numbers, while the vampires would selectively feed on those who remained strong enough to provide quality sustenance. The facility's residents found themselves caught in a systematic slaughter, designed by creatures that understood resource management better than most humans. But the alliance wouldn't last long. Marcus had been monitoring the facility's security feeds from an abandoned guard station when he discovered something that changed their entire understanding of the situation. "Sarah, you need to see this," he whispered, pointing to screens showing the lower levels they'd never been allowed to access. The basement levels weren't empty. They were full of cages, and those cages had been opened from the inside. "Those aren't new vampires," Marcus said, his voice trembling as he scrolled through weeks of security footage. "They're the children. They're our children." The video showed Emma, Sarah's daughter, along with dozens of other kids who had been separated from their families during processing. But they weren't human anymore. Their eyes reflected the emergency lighting like mirrors. Their movements were too fast and too precise, and when they smiled at the cameras, their teeth were razor-sharp fangs. The government hadn't just been studying human behavioral responses to crisis situations. They'd been creating the crisis by turning the victims' own children into the monsters they'd have to survive against. The truth was more devastating than any physical threat Sarah had faced. Her daughter Emma stood at the end of the corridor, no longer the frightened child who had been taken for orientation 6 months ago. The transformation had been gradual, systematic, and irreversible. "Mommy." Emma's voice carried the same sweet tone Sarah remembered, but underneath it was something ancient and hungry. "They told us you were coming to visit." Behind Emma, other children emerged from the shadows. Kids who had been separated from their parents, all bearing the same pale complexion, the same predatory grace, the same terrible intelligence that marked them as something no longer human. The government researchers had not just been studying human survival responses. They'd been creating a new species. Using the children as initial subjects, they'd perfected a controlled vampiric transformation that retained memory and personality while removing human empathy and installing apex predator instincts. The zombie outbreak above ground had been real, but it was also a distraction. The true experiment was happening in these underground facilities, where desperate families had voluntarily delivered their children to become weapons against their own species. Emma tilted her head as she approached, moving with the fluid motions of something that had learned to hunt in enclosed spaces. "Don't be afraid, Mommy. It doesn't hurt for very long, and then we can be together forever." The other vampire children spread out through the corridor with military precision, cutting off every escape route while the zombie hordes continued their assault from above. Sarah realized that the chaotic attack patterns she'd witnessed weren't random at all. They were being coordinated by these transformed children who understood human psychology better than any adult predator ever could. The perfect trap had been sprung using the strongest bond in human nature: parental love. Every parent in the facility would hesitate to harm a child, even a child that was no longer human. That hesitation would cost them their lives, their blood, and ultimately their species. As Emma reached out with fingers that ended in razor-sharp claws, Sarah understood that the real horror wasn't being hunted by monsters. It was being hunted by the monsters you'd die to protect, knowing that love itself had become humanity's final weakness. The quarantine bunker breach represents one of humanity's darkest possibilities. What happens when the very institutions we trust to protect us become the architects of our destruction? The government's promise of safety became a sophisticated trap, using our most fundamental instincts against us. Sarah's story reminds us that the greatest horrors often come not from external monsters, but from the corruption of love, trust, and hope. The researchers who designed Project Deadfall understood that humans will walk willingly into any trap if they believe it will save their families. They weaponized parental devotion, turning children into predators and parents into prey. The facility's three-way battle between humans, zombies, and vampire children wasn't just about survival. It was about the complete breakdown of everything that makes us human. When the people meant to protect us conduct experiments that turn our own children against us, when government facilities become hunting grounds and when promises of sanctuary become death sentences, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the real monsters wear uniforms and carry clipboards. The most chilling aspect of this nightmare is not the supernatural elements. It's how plausible the human elements really are. History has shown us repeatedly that desperate people will trust almost anyone who promises safety, and that trust can be exploited in ways that destroy the very humanity it was meant to preserve. In the end, the bunker breach wasn't a failure of security systems or an accident of nature. It was the inevitable result of treating human beings as expendable test subjects in someone else's grand experiment. The real horror story isn't about zombies and vampires. It's about what we become when we allow fear to make us forget our own humanity. What did you think about this twisted tale of government deception and family horror? The idea that our own institutions might conduct experiments using our children as weapons hits different than your typical monster story, doesn't it? This is what Shadowverse is all about. Exploring the darkest corners of human nature through supernatural horror that feels just a little too possible. If stories like this give you those chills that make you question what's really happening behind closed doors, make sure you subscribe so you never miss our latest nightmares. And here's what I really want to know. What horror topic should we tackle next? Drop a comment below with your darkest fears, your most unsettling what-if scenarios, or those conspiracy theories that keep you awake at night. Your suggestions become our next deep exploration into the shadows of human nature. Whether it's government cover-ups, corporate experiments gone wrong, or just good old-fashioned supernatural terror, your comments guide our journey into the darkness. So subscribe, hit that notification bell, and let's continue exploring what scares us most about the world we actually live in. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them after this one.